You're tuned into the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe.
Greetings, followers. It is I, Cardinal Sin, and welcome to another episode of Into the Fringe. Our guest tonight is Peter Robbins, who is an investigative writer, best-selling author, and lecturer, well known for his UFO-related papers, columns, articles, editorials, commentaries, and talks. He is a regular fixture on talk, radio, and podcasts, and has appeared as a guest on and consultant to numerous television programs and documentaries. He is host of the weekly radio show / podcast, Meanwhile, Here on Earth, Monday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Among the venues Peter has spoken at are the National Press Club in Washington, Manhattan's Juilliard School and the School of Visual Arts, Boston's Cambridge Hospital, Cornell University, the University of Arkansas, the Fund for UFO Research, and Bufora. Robbins was editorial assistant on a United Nations Secretary General's requested report for the establishment of a UN UFO department and editorial assistant for a requested paper for the House of Lords debate on UFOs. He was a founding member of the Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation and served as executive assistant to Mr. Hopkins. Peter has written for Open Minds magazine, Fate, Phenomena, UFO Data Magazine, UFO Matrix, UFO Magazine, both in the UK and in the US, Outer Limits Magazine, and numerous other publications. Peter has been an advisor, consultant, and co-founder to numerous UFO festivals and conferences around the world. In 2012, Robbins was made a member of the French Académie d'Ufologie and was invited to give testimony at the Citizens' Hearing on Disclosure at the National Press Club. Peter is an associate producer of the award-winning documentary Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton, and most recently, the producer/writer of the documentary The Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death of James Forrestal. He lives and works in the countryside just outside of Ithaca, New York. Welcome, my friend Peter Robbins, back to Into the Fringe.
Thank you, Cardinal. It's good to be back.
Wonderful to see you. And let's go ahead and get right into it. I understand that you have returned from a big event. What can you tell us without killing us?
Well, I got back late last night from 2 days in Washington, D.C. for a rather remarkable press conference held Tuesday morning at the National Press Club. And the subject was UFOs and nuclear weapons, and how there is not just a remarkable history of UFOs affecting weapon systems on nuclear bases, but a remarkably well-documented series of events, dozens of events over the last decades. And this event, which was organized, second press conference of its kind ever, and also at the National Press Club, by Robert Salas, who is a former United States Air Force captain and nuclear missile crew commander. It also included Robert Jameson, a former USAF captain and nuclear missile targeting officer, David Shindley, former Air Force captain and nuclear missile crew commander, and Robert Jacobs, a former Air Force lieutenant and missile test photographic officer. Jacobs was the only one who testified via remote, but the other three officers were there in the room with us. And I knew most of their stories to some degree, Robert's especially, because he is a good friend and longtime colleague. And it's a story that has been public for many years. Some years back, Bob published a book that he co-wrote with James Klotz called Faded Giant. It is the story of the nuclear weapons event that he was caught up in.
Here, let me make that big so that you can show it again.
Yeah, it's called Faded Giant.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are serious about the subject of UFOs, even more so if that seriousness manifests itself by continuing to build a library on the subject, it's an invaluable book. In 1967, Captain, then Robert Salas, was in charge of a battery of 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles, all targeted for different locations in the Soviet Union. A highly responsible job by any standards. And his job included, if they received orders to deploy those missiles, he had to make sure it was done. And that being almost 50 feet underground in the old analog days, the responsibility was very grave. This at the height of the Cold War. And at a certain point, they started hearing live feed conversations, men with elevated tension in their voices on the ground, talking about a large glowing object that had come in over the nuclear base. And he watched really helplessly as it shut down all 10 nuclear missiles. When I first met Bob and read his account, again, I was aware of others, but it wasn't until another remarkable book came out not that long after.
I'm going to guess it's UFOs and Nukes.
That's the one.
Let me make you big again.
It's a monster. Many years.
It's a real doorstopper.
Dedicated research by the go-to investigative writer on this subject, the great Robert Hastings. And this is the book that really changed the game. And not just in terms of accounts, but in terms of the kind of evidence you could bring into a court of law, establish that this was a reality, that some portion of these other intelligences who are in what we will call UFOs or UAPs have repeatedly, since the beginning of the nuclear age, so to say, been affecting our nuclear capabilities on the most warlike level. I guess, given our options, it is much better, all things considered, that they have been involved in shutting down these weapon systems rather than setting them off. I think we can all agree on that.
I seem to recall hearing that in the Soviet Union, they had similar events, but instead of turning off the missiles, they were turned on and they couldn't shut them off.
It's a very chilling history. And again, Bob Salas had organized an event like this at the National Press Club some years back, but he decided to do it again. And it was either late last year or early this year that he announced his intentions, putting together all of the expenses to bring these other witnesses together, cover their flights, put them up at hotels, rent the proper space within the National Press Club, arrange for the logistics, was going to cost $13,000. And between GoFundMe and good folks all over who contributed to those expenses being defrayed, we met that goal several months ago, and the event came off, I think, quite brilliantly. I now know that in the broadcast version, there were some technical problems and, echoes and the like, but the content you can't touch. It's extremely important, and I felt very historic. Again, you can read books or watch a documentary and get some of the sense of this history. But to actually see these men right there, and more to realize they're all well in their 70s, early 80s. And at a certain point in history, they will no longer be with us. And part of the strategy for doing all possible to diminish, keep this subject out of the realm of, major news media is for the forces that be, in this case, the Air Force, to do nothing to get these men on record, just the opposite. Hopefully they'll all die off, and, a recorded account does not have quite the impact, or a written account, as does seeing people right there in front of you, not just talking about what happened, but the impact on their lives, how they felt about it, what the implications were as they reflected back on it, the secrecy that was imposed on them, and how really you get to a certain point in your life where what's more important, something that happened 40, 50 years ago or more that you were told to keep quiet about, or your own personal desire and commitment to get this down on the record. And
I understand, Peter, that one of the speakers had been carrying this guilty secret for 40 years and only spoke about it very recently.
That's correct. That's correct. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these 4 testimonies, although the proceedings that was produced for the event, basically the major press release here, included not just the accounts of other former Air Force officers who were also involved in similar events, in each case signed, witnessed, notarized affidavits attesting to their honesty, and in each case, and it's important to say, because if not, there are always going to be those people who are going to question how much they got paid to do it. Well, none of them has ever been paid anything to put their accounts on the record. And maybe equally as important, none of them really wanted the notoriety attached to it, except for Bob, who became very public on this some years back and became a very important and respected activist in this area of UFO studies. These are men leading quiet lives who could have lived without this, but felt compelled to put their accounts on the record as well. When it was all over, questions were asked. As is always the case in such things, there should never be an empty seat at an event like this. It was not open.
I was going to ask you how many press showed up.
I don't know the exact number, but I do know that Fox and CNN were there very, very publicly. And they were not there so much to report on it as to do interviews that will contribute to major documentaries that both Fox and CNN are preparing for next year. Because next year, it's all going to hit the fan all over again. Next year is the 75th anniversary of our modern age of UFOs. It's the 75th anniversary of the Kenneth Arnold sightings in Washington State. in June 24th, 1947, that kicked the whole thing off. And then about a week later, the crash or crashes of objects unknown on the plains of St. Augustine and otherwise outside the city limits of a then small town in New Mexico called Roswell. And I remember back, you may too, Gil, and some of our viewers, that in 1997, the 50th anniversary, the Western world and the media really went over the top, in terms of UFOs, so much so that I think it almost started to dull the public perception of the subject. They were just getting hit all through that summer by different documentaries, old and new. I spent a good part of that summer in the UK, going back twice, once on a book tour, another time to give some talks. And the United Kingdom was equally inundated with new magazines and, souvenir journals. And of course, we are now kind of coming well out of the age of print magazines, but the newsstands here and abroad were filled with them. So it was actually rather gratifying and an interesting sign of the times and the way that this subject is now, over the past few years, being treated by major media associated with both, archetypical conservative reporting and liberal reporting. It doesn't matter. I was interviewed somewhat extensively by CNN. Bob and the other witnesses and other people were interviewed by Fox well into the afternoon. We did manage to have a wonderful lunch together at the National Press Club, courtesy of the great Stephen Bassett, who is really a unique figure in the world of UFO studies. Steve is...
Yeah, he's been on the show.
He is a force of nature. Steve is brilliant, absolutely dedicated, and literally a warrior in terms of leading, as well as he can, a movement toward full disclosure of this subject. He is, in fact, a lobbyist, a registered lobbyist in Washington, D.C., fighting for this to happen. And networking.
I would go so far as to call him a bulldog when it comes to this.
Yeah. The luncheon, which lasted about 3 or 4 hours, it was just pretty much nonstop talk. Him, again, Robert Salas, and the other two witnesses who testified in person, the great Daniel Sheehan, who is, an activist in civil rights, Indian affairs, UFO secrecy, one of the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered, and one of the nicest people too, and an assortment of guests. My friend Jordan Pease, who is a well-known and respected researcher and runs a paranormal study center in Ashland, Oregon, was there. It was a great afternoon of just continuing this discussion on a much more informal level. And yesterday, everybody pretty much headed home. I got home late last night and have spent a good part of the day just starting to organize this material, go over it in my mind, and preparing for a radio broadcast I'll be doing Monday night, bringing together some of the people that were there to discuss this. Right now, waiting to hear back from Robert Salas, but at the least it will be myself and Stephen Bassett and Daniel Sheehan. I won't even say who else, but I hope 1 or 2 other surprise guests. And that will be from 7 to 9 Eastern Standard Time this coming Monday on Meanwhile Here on Earth on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. But it was, the other thing I haven't talked about really is, as fascinating as this is, and at points, some of the testimony, even for somebody like me who is not a newbie to this subject and has seen, read, and appreciated a lot of aspects of it. But there were points where the testimony, it almost veered into, well, it veered into what somebody who is not knowledgeable on this subject would immediately defer to as science fiction. At one point, in fact, I'll give you an example.
And
One of the
real quick,
witnesses,
Peter, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, is it okay for me to put the URL to the live stream that you sent me into the chat?
well, it is, except that that was the live stream, and that
Mhm.
was live. That finished with the live testimony. Right now, maybe it's even searchable. If somebody can find it during the show, let us know. The event was the UFO and Nukes press conference. I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know
showing up.
if the link is live. I mean, if it's, you can click
It's
on
working.
it is.
Yeah.
Well, then, in that case, by all means, promote the heck out of it and send me the link by email so I can do the same. It
All
wasn't
right.
up early today, so I'm glad it is. This is something that should go viral. Again, production problems, especially at the beginning aside, it's the content that matters. And this is something that everybody needs to know about. It's not for UFO enthusiasts or those with an interest in the subject. This is the real deal. This is other intelligences coming in over nuclear weapons bases for decades now and shutting down our weapon systems. This is serious. I don't know what could be more serious except, again, setting them off. But it bespeaks
Yeah.
a certain,
I can't think of anything more dire.
yeah. And the implications of it are very interesting. I mean, what can we deduce? Once again, sometimes your mind only has models in science fiction to fall back on. In this case, one of the first things that occurred to me was as fine a B science fiction movie, well, as fine a science fiction movie as is ever produced, the great original. Um, um, Come on, Peter. Why am I blanking?
While you're blanking, I just wanted to share the website so people would get an idea of what you're talking about.
There you go. This gives you a sense of what was going to go down on Tuesday and what in fact did. And I was very impressed with how it all went. It really was a first-class event, and it was important to have it at the National Press Club, as opposed to, in somebody's room or a town hall or a church basement or wherever.
Sure.
It warranted it. It was that important. And again, that these four men came together, three of them in person, one of them really having trouble walking, spent part of the time in a wheelchair, but he stood at that podium and he
Yeah,
said what he had to say.
that
And
was amazing.
yeah, exactly. So very briefly here, give you an idea. First thing we can do is, you know what? Let's go to the pictures. Let's take a look at
All
some of
right.
the images that I sent you, starting with that very first one, which is at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, two separate events. 20 nuclear missiles were disabled. 20 nuclear missiles. all
Which I
targeted-
understand is nearly impossible to happen.
Well, certainly these
I
systems,
mean, on its own, it's almost impossible.
we're so well serviced, we're so well taken care of, we're so carefully observed. Again, this is all pre, modern age of digitization of everything. It
Sure.
was mechanics, but that's how we got to the moon. And the graphic, of course, taken from the cover of Robert Salas's book. Go to that next image there. That is a shot that I took. Well, all these are. Yeah. Obviously, podium at the National Press Club.
Mm-hmm.
And next. Right. Here we have Bob Salas on the right and Robert Jameson on the left. Next. This is the view out of my hotel room yesterday.
Wow.
Yesterday morning. No question where I was.
Guess not.
Next.
There's Bob Salas.
Yep, who began the press conference and did a great job of bringing it all together. As you know, Cardinal, it began with a wider review of important developments going back to Roswell, including testimony from the late, great Jesse Marcel Jr. and other key people as we move forward in the history of documented military events on the subject. And ultimately, a series of graphics as well as images of individuals, quotations, and the like.
I have to say, Peter, having watched the event, even seeing Jesse Marcel Jr. in a video, that information was new, at least to me, and it was very powerful. So even though he's no longer with us, he's still making an impact.
Yeah, in fact, Jesse, who I was very proud to call a friend, whose father, of course, was caught up at the very beginning of the so-called UFO cover-up. Jesse Sr. Was a major, a World War II fighter pilot shot down over Germany, served the end of the war as a POW, a true American hero who was the base intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield. He was the first military person to go out to the debris field and see the remains of this crashed object from parts unknown. And he was the one who went through the ultimate humiliation of, after being photographed with actual parts, actual material from the crash, was then forced the next day to pose with parts of a Mogul weather balloon. And
I'm being overflown by a very loud helicopter. I apologize. I'm apparently under the flight path of Fort Riley, and for some reason they don't obey the 500-foot FAA ceiling here. So,
well, I'm not going to put in a formal complaint myself. I have enough on my plate.
Yeah.
But
I do always go outside when I'm not live streaming and give them the finger because I know they can see it.
I'm sure that depresses them no end. Probably all in therapy from that.
It makes me feel a lot better.
That's the important thing.
Yeah.
Jesse's, really, it was the ultimate humiliation. He was the fall guy, not a fall guy, in the public's mind. And that photo of him posing by that weather balloon debris was on front pages of newspapers, not just around the country, but around the world.
With that look on his face of, you've got to be kidding.
It drove him into deep depression and ultimately a problem with alcohol. It's only through the tenacity and the hard work and the great research of Mr. Stanton T. Friedman, who we miss every day, who rediscovered Jesse, who was by then well in his 80s, retired in the South, and got testimony from him. And that was the beginning, really, of Roswell.
I'm lucky enough that the very first UFO lecture that I promoted here in Lawrence was Stanton Friedman, and I had lunch with Stan, and I learned things during lunch that he didn't talk about during the 3-hour-long presentation, but he did tell me that he was, I think, doing an interview on either a radio station or a TV station, and one of the people that was there said, "You really ought to talk to Jesse Marcel. You know, he handled the wreckage."
Exactly.
And he said, "Who?" And that's kind of how he got associated with him.
That's right. That's right. That's the way it happens sometimes.
And I'm proud to say that I met Jesse Marcel Jr. at the same event where we became friends.
Yeah. And in fact, after having developed a cordial acquaintanceship and then a good and true friendship with Jesse Jr., who, of course, was one of the most significant people to testify at the citizens' hearing on disclosure in 2013, again organized by the great Stephen Bassett. The very last time I saw Jesse was the morning after the conference, in our hotel lobby saying goodbye. And that was it. I would say for anybody interested in knowing more about his father, Jesse Sr., he wrote a very memorable book, and I'm trying to remember the title of it. The movie I was trying to think of was, of course, The Day the Earth Stood Still, where a very a classy alien in the form of the great British character actor Michael Rennie comes to Earth with his very intimidating robot, Gort, to give us a message, to essentially get our act together or suffer the consequences. This is not that, but in that sense, this is, letting us know repeatedly that they can do what they want about these horrible weapons that we have developed. But
I need to interrupt just for a moment, Peter, to ask you the name of your kitty cat.
That is Juno.
Juno, right.
The cat that tells me how to run my life and what to do, who is here under protest because he wants to be outside, but it is raining rather hard.
Oh, is it?
One of those rare times where I tell him what to do, and he will stay in my face until I am worn down by the fact that I'm in love with cats and a sucker for whatever they tell me to do as a rule. So
I know
I'll
that
probably be part of the show for a while until they get bored.
I know that people in the chat would be interested in knowing your cat's name. So,
well, easy to understand. And this is a cat with an attitude. His name is Juno, which in fact is the name of a Roman goddess. And he knows it. He's got an issue with it. And every once in a while when I walk by, he will give me a whack or try to draw blood. I think it has to do with the, everybody remember the wonderful Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue? How do you do?
I think that was written by Shel Silverstein, wasn't it?
I think so. This is a boy named after a girl, and he has issues with it. Don't you, dear? Maybe.
He's a very pretty kitty.
I tell him he is extremely rare. He is a gray tiger cat, and there are only about a zillion of them on the planet. So eat your heart out, folks. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these before. Hi, darling. So,
hi, Juno.
One of the most insightful documents, so to say, to give us some insight into the life of Jesse Marcel, and this is worth a detour. is in the realm of the arts rather than the sciences, and it's the film Roswell that really is the brainchild
With
of the
Martin
great,
Sheen.
right? Paul Davids, one of the most singularly interesting, a real Renaissance man in the world of UFO studies. Paul created this film with Martin Sheen and Kyle MacLachlan playing Jesse over the span of his life from when things happened at Roswell till toward the end of his life. And what you get is how damaging it is at that level of ridicule. All of his old unit, they hated him for embarrassing them
Yeah.
by being ordered to tell the truth. And then everybody, backtracking and him left holding the bag, so to say. But I digress. Let's go to
Well,
that
and
next.
also while we're on that point, they couldn't have felt very good about him, being that they were the only atomic bombing group in the world, and the public information officer should know the difference between a weather balloon, top secret or not, and the remains of a flying disc.
Well, that was actually Walter Haut, who was the one who released the statement originally. Jesse was the base intelligence officer,
Correct.
so one could
Yeah.
say he should have known it even more so, and
Yeah.
he did. And that brings up another very important point, Cardinal, which is that the whole UFO nukes issue begins at the very beginning. Why did that crash occur outside of Roswell, New Mexico, as opposed
Trinity.
to any other place in the world? Because the 509th Bomb Wing of the Army Air Corps, located just outside of the town itself, was the only, as you've noted, the only nuclear strike force in the world. In fact, I think it's important to remember where the world of UFO history and real acknowledged history intersect. The Enola Gay, the aircraft that dropped that first bomb on Hiroshima, began its run from Roswell, New Mexico, flew to California or one of the outer islands to have what was referred to as the gadget attached, and then flew on to Japan. So as far as I'm concerned, that hangar, the one that's still standing, that is the hangar that the Enola Gay left from. It should have a giant honking brass plaque on it, noting it. It's also the location where a little less than 2 years later, the debris and the bodies were brought before being flown out to 8th Army headquarters in Texas. So we have a divergence right there of two extraordinarily important moments in world history and human history. Yeah. But let's go to that next image.
It's really heady, and especially, as you mentioned, for those that are not intermediate like most of our audience is, thankfully, it just weighs very heavy. The whole thing is very important, very dire.
It sure is. It is
all
heavy.
Right, next image will be this one.
Yeah. Over to the right is, again,
I had a hard time pronouncing his name.
It's David Schindel, even though it looks a little more complicated than that. And a lovely man. Robert Jameson is the gentleman who is up at the podium at this moment, but I was just trying to get, a bit of a cinema verite sense here of what was going on at the table. Next. David Schindel. There he is. And that is him about the time of the events in question. And again, David was at the time an Air Force captain and nuclear missile crew commander. Once again, a job with an awful lot of responsibility. And stationed at the same base, by the way, in Minot, that Robert Salas was. The events happening fairly close together. And the next image shows what happens after more than 50 years. David struck me, like all of them, as a man of, he just radiated ethics. This was not something that had anything to do with wanting any glory or gain or money or
Oh no, you
power.
could tell that it weighed very heavily on his mind. I believe he said that after 40 years of keeping this secret, he was finally allowed to tell his wife.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it is with, how can I say, the people who love their country. They are true patriots. They served at a time of tremendous tension. They had, to say highly responsible jobs is almost an understatement.
Yeah.
And when they were told not to talk about it, they left the service and they didn't talk about it. And in David's case, it wasn't until he heard an account by the senior officer who decades before had told him to not talk about it that he felt compelled to come forward. And he did. And again, you do this work that we do. And in my case, it's involved interviewing many people with military backgrounds and hundreds of others who are experiencers and abductees. And several times a year, it comes out of nowhere sometimes, or it's triggered by an event like yesterday. But I find myself just literally feeling it in my chest and saying to myself words to the effect of, my God, this is really happening. Nuclear weapons are being shut down by intelligences in UFOs. People are being taken and from their homes, floated through plate glass windows or ceilings or walls and taken aboard.
And no one knows better about that than you.
Well, no, people who know about it better than me are the people that it happens to. I know about it, I guess, as well as anybody can, just on the other side of it, because I spent most of my life chronicling it and, having to make judgments of character. But there is so much hard information that could be brought into courts of law if such things were judged in courts of law, which they're not. And
well, for instance, what happened to Helen and all the regressions I imagine that you've seen working with Bud, there's certainly very few people out there that have the sort of broad knowledge that you have.
Well, thank you for that. I'm still very much in the dark about what it's all about, and I refuse to say something is when it may be. But I guess my point here is that every once in a while, it hits me very hard, having nothing to do with the intellect or knowledge. It's visceral. And I think to myself, if I ever get to the point where I'm just doing this work and it's another abduction, it's another person taken, it's another event where nuclear weapons were shut down by other intelligences with technology we may not even be able to imagine fully. Or if I ever get to that point, I should not be in this work. And I say to the good people who are watching this show, who are commenting here, who are doing their best to educate themselves because they are intellectually curious, free-thinking people who are not limited by their own experiences, or because they have had experiences, or because they know and love somebody who has, or they have educated themselves. Stanton Friedman never had a UFO event, but there's an example of a great scientist with an open mind who pursued the subject and was able to establish it in no uncertain terms repeatedly as factual as the chairs that you and I are sitting in right now. And stay open, my friends. Do your own research. Keep reading books. There are so many good books in the history of UFO publishing, and they keep coming out. One of the reasons why I feel it's so important, if you have, let's face it, the space and a little discretionary spending to build a library rather than do all of your information gathering online, which of course is a miraculous source, but the internet, as I've said before, is a double-edged sword. And often there are allegations, they're made with great passion, or God knows there are lots of images and footage. But can you establish to your own satisfaction that the footage was legitimately shot by real people who live in a very real place, who stand behind it, that it has been ideally subjected to some professional or quality amateur photo analysis, that claims of people who, some of them who are well known, that sound outrageous, but may be true, but may be total and complete bullshit, are vetted by you. One of the things about a good quality UFO book is if it's based on crap, it will be attacked and it will be shown to be problematic. Otherwise, it will get a chance to stand the test of time and become an important point of reference for you as you educate yourself, as you learn more, as you want to share with friends or people that ultimately may come to you as somebody who's known, as somebody who takes the subject seriously and is out there in the field. And, you know, two examples today, Robert Hastings' book, UFOs and Nukes, and Robert Salas and is it Jane Clout's book, Faded Giant, on his Maelstrom Air Force Base nuclear shutdown. I should also say, because this is a point of curiosity for me, and when I do interviews on my weekly radio show, one of the things that's fairly unique about them is that most of them are in-depth autobiographical interviews, especially with people who are quote unquote well-known, who a lot of us, as we become more and more familiar with the work, think we know because we know their books. We've heard them at conferences. We've seen them on television shows, hear them in radio and podcast interviews. But of course, we really don't know who they are. So my format is to give them an opportunity to tell us who they are. In the past months, both Robert Salas and Stephen Bassett have been my guests and talked about their formative years, you know, what brought them to this work. And with Bob, he is very public, although, you know, he doesn't advertise it, but it's not a secret that besides this history that he had and this event as a United States Air Force captain, charged with a very high level of responsibility, he is also a UFO abductee. And
I didn't know that.
yeah, we learn about that in that interview. You can see them both. Just go to YouTube after this show,
Right.
and Google and type "meanwhile, comma, here on Earth" into the YouTube search engine, or "Meanwhile Here on Earth, Robert Salas," or "Meanwhile Here on Earth, Stephen Bassett," and learn the stories of their lives and how they arrived at being the people that they are. With Robert, there are two shows where he headlines. The one where it's just his name, and I think that goes back to the spring, and one only, I don't know, 6 weeks ago or something like that, where it's him and myself and Ryan Sprigg and Jason McClellan and Shane Hurd asking him questions about the upcoming event, which of course was on Tuesday. But again, Monday, we will do a analysis of what happened at the National Press Club just 2 short days ago. And I'm already looking forward to that. Again, just to complete the point, when you look into this subject, do it not from a believer point of view, even if you know it's true from your own experience. But the best of us have to remain skeptics, and that is very different than being a debunker. A skeptic is
Yes.
somebody who questions. You could say an arch skeptic borders on being a debunker. It's like a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat. I mean, a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican, sort of touching the edge of the other side.
Kind of a Joe Manchin character.
There you go. A debunker is essentially a nice name for an arrogant son of a bitch who knows that there is no such thing, for example, as truly anomalous UFOs. How do they know? Well, because they're very special people. And they know that certain aspects of the unknown are impossible. How?
Peter, I remember.
Can't be. Therefore, it isn't. Therefore, it's something else. That's
when I was speaking with Stanton Friedman, he had mentioned that Philip Klass, arch debunker, gave him a quest of sorts to come up with actual documents that are verifiable that mentioned UFOs and UFO reality up to 10, and that he would pay Stan $1,000 for each one. And Stan sent him 20, and Phil Klass eventually ended up paying him $10,000. And I think that Stan said that he just put the check up on the wall rather than cashed it.
I'm not sure about that. I hope he didn't. I hope he made
made a copy,
photocopy of it and put that on the wall and then cashed the check. But yes, he did get a check. That is absolutely factual. I did see a copy of it and enjoyed looking at it very much. But again, a debunker knows the unknowable. How? Again, the mantra for me is it can't be. Therefore, it isn't. Therefore, it's something else. Therefore, my job is to pat you on the head and explain it away in some pseudo-scientific manner. Let me, again, let's go to the next image right now.
Sure.
Because I want to get to one from the witness who was testifying from his home in California, because it was a very special testimony. And there you have Dr. Robert Jacobs. And Dr. Jacobs, again, to remind our viewers, at the time of his event, was an Air Force lieutenant and missile test photographic officer. He filmed, these things, missile tests and the like, as they were happening, launches, etc. And his account differed from everybody's in a way that I was not familiar with. And I mean, he had me absolutely enwrapped. And I want to read a little bit of his testimony. Okay. In September 1964, I was a first lieutenant in the United States Air Force and officer in charge of photo instrumentation for the 1369th Photographic Squadron based at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. In that capacity, I was in charge of an experimental photographic project which utilized a high-powered telescope camera system located at Anderson Peak near Big Sur, California. The purpose of the project was to film missiles launched from Vandenberg and to capture all three stages of powered flight on 35 millimeter motion picture film. Air Force planned to analyze these films and evaluate the performance, etc. One day in September 1964, I was involved in the filming of a UFO as it maneuvered near a separated dummy nuclear warhead that had been launched from Vandenberg minutes earlier aboard an Atlas D ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. Based on entries from my personal log, which I still possess, the launch occurred on one of those dates, September 2nd, 3rd, or 15th. However, according to the individual who later analyzed the film, Major Florence J. Mansman, the date of the launch was definitely September 15, 1964. So, at the time of the filming, no one at the telescope site, including myself, was aware of the UFO encounter while it occurred, as the image, Orthodon 2, being recorded by a 35 millimeter motion picture camera, was under a black, light-tight shroud. Later that day, I personally escorted the film back to Vandenberg Air Force Base so it could be developed. A day or two after the filming, I was unexpectedly ordered by Major Mansman to attend a screening of the footage in his office. When I arrived, I saw the 16 millimeter projector had been set up. I also noticed that other persons were present, including two individuals dressed in civilian clothes who I did not recognize. The telescope project's engineer, Kingston A. George, was not present at the screening. Once I was seated, Major Mansman told me in a serious tone, "Watch this, Lieutenant." At first, the film was unremarkable except for the clarity of the images. I immediately identified the film as that which we had shot from Big Sur. The Atlas missile performed flawlessly, and each stage sequence was clearly visible. However, shortly after the dummy warhead separated from the nose cone, another object suddenly appeared, coming into view on the left side of the camera frame, and quickly approached the warhead as it traveled downrange at thousands of miles per hour. The object then began to circle the warhead in a polar arc, and at 4 different points, which I estimate to be approximately 90-degree intervals, directed something at it, resembling a beam of light. Seconds later, the warhead began to tumble and quickly lost attitude, soon falling out of the camera frame. At approximately the same time, the UFO also moved off out of camera frame and direction as it first appeared. I was utterly astonished by what I saw! After the film ended, Major Mansman asked me if I and the others at the telescope site had been playing around during the filming, and seemed to be implying that we had somehow used trick photography to create the phenomena. I told him that we had not. He then asked me to explain the filmed encounter we had just witnessed. I responded by saying, "It looks like we got a UFO." Major Mansman quickly admonished me, saying that I was never to repeat those words. Specifically, he said, quote, "Lieutenant, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened," end quote. During the exchange, I noticed that the 2 men in civilian suits were eyeing me intently. Then Mansman told me that he did not need to remind me of the consequences of a security breach, and I was leaving. He said confidentially, quote, "If at some point in the future you find yourself somehow forced to comment on the matter, you are to say that it was laser tracking." After a few more words, he dismissed me. Final thought. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1982, I decided to write an article about the UFO encounter for Omni magazine, which I hope would be accepted for its monthly UFO update column. I was convinced that more time than enough time had passed since the incident to prevent a public discussion of it. However, because Major Mansman had told me in his office that the film event had never happened, I had no personal knowledge regarding its initial classification level or whether it had already been declassified. In any case, it all just seemed so long ago by then that I felt comfortable writing about the incident without having to worry about any official repercussions. Unfortunately, Omni rejected the article. However, it was later published by the National Enquirer and a sensationalized rewrite by the tabloid, much to my chagrin. Then he goes on from there about how he ultimately reconnected with Mansman and that Mansman had gone public with it. But what we watched at the National Press Club, and I'm hoping is fairly clear on the replay at the link that Cardinal is providing you on this show, was a very simple animation of this mock nuclear warhead, which could have been real. In this case, it was mock. And there it is in the blackness of space, and in comes a classic UFO, and at thousands of miles an hour, flawlessly circles it. And at each quarter turn, shoots a beam of light at it. 2, 3, 4, at which point it destabilizes, started to roll, and goes out of frame, out of control. And then the UFO disappears in the direction that it came. This is even a more, in a way, interesting display of their power and their knowing that only a very small handful of human beings will ever see this, but it will go up the chain of command to the highest levels and join the documented cases of completely shutting down actual, real nuclear weapon systems that will form this secret history that is no longer a secret history. Let's take a look at the next image.
All right.
And I think this is the last one. And I included it because during the Condon investigation, which was a pretty hyped up job coming out of the University of Colorado's report following the end of Project Blue Book and the Air Force's official getting out of the UFO business, which of course was nonsense. Raymond Fowler, who is one of our most respected seniors, still with us, still working on a new book.
Yes.
UFO authors, somebody
and
who
scientist.
Immense respect and admiration for, learned back in the day of yet one more encounter of a nuclear weapon shutdown due to a UFO incursion. Again, all of this material is covered in the press conference link, which began at about 9 in the morning and terminated at about 11. It was about a full 2 hours. And then there was a Q&A period. Then people broke up for interviews and ultimately for lunch.
It's a very powerful
off the press, ladies
event.
and gentlemen. This happened 2 days ago.
Yeah. It's a very powerful event to watch. And certainly if there are any people in our audience or watching this later that are on the fence about UFOs and UFO reality, I think this is probably pretty close to as good as it gets.
Yeah, I think so too. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it here on your show, Cardinal. It is something that will be talked about more and more, certainly over the next few weeks on podcasts and radio shows and different kinds of broadcasts. And you are the first radio show that I'm aware of where this material has been discussed immediately after the fact of the event.
Wow. Well, I'm very grateful. That's great. So now that you're back home and at least somewhat settled, can you give us a breakdown of how it struck you, how you feel? I mean, you knew a lot of this information before, but as you said, seeing it from, this new individual and with Robert Salas and Stephen Bassett and everyone that was there, can you give us a general impression of the effect that it had on you, especially seeing the mainstream news taking it very seriously?
Yeah. Well, from a very personal point of view, it was really great to get out of the house for a few days. The last live UFO related event that I attended, as opposed to the streaming events or the online events that I've taken part in, and others to come up fairly soon. The last time I was out and about in the real world talking to a real live audience, in this case only as an audience member myself, um, was a small one-day conference in Knoxville, Tennessee, in mid-March of last year, right within 24, 48 hours of the president declaring a national emergency around the pandemic. And it was great to be back in Washington. I really enjoyed being back in the National Press Club. It was wonderful to see a number of old friends, including Steve Bassett and Danny Sheehan, Jordan Pease, as I mentioned before, from Ashland, Oregon. Drove down there with a good friend who I hadn't seen in some time. And Will Gallison, a friend of mine from Manhattan, came in for the event. It was great to see him. Will had spent a good part of the pandemic in Costa Rica, a smart move. Also, he and Robert Salas knew each other because they both became involved in researching. Some of you may be aware, several years ago, the story emerged, which for many of us sounded very tabloid, of alleged non-human mummies found in the area of the Nazca Plains in Peru. And I know Bob, like me, was a skeptic to start with. Will went right there and made it his business to have permission to see them, to examine them for himself, to speak with the experts. And Bob followed. And both of them became very seriously involved, not just in investigating this, but in putting forward with the information that they had each compiled independently, that these were real, truly anomalous, other
Peter,
beings.
maybe you can help jog my memory.
Yeah.
Were these the mummies that had sort of the elongated heads?
Yeah, I think one of them did. There were, I believe, two types. I'm not the go-to guy on this, but because I respect Robert Salas and my friend Will, and the fact that they went down there and were able to, penetrate the officialdom and see the statistical analyses for themselves, to look at, and I believe with, proper gloves in the right conditions, because these are being held in a certain, climate friendly environments because of their fragility, that they both have come out very strongly that these are the remains of non-human beings that
Wow.
are humanoid.
Well, that's
But
evidence right there.
yeah, but that they are not mock-ups as we have encountered in the past. And I'm reminded of the great P.T. Barnum, who made quite a lot of money getting the suckers in. And at one point in his famous museum in New York City, around the time of the Civil War, advertised that he had acquired a mermaid. And for like 25 cents each or whatever the admission price, he brought them in by the hundreds and then thousands to see the top of a mummified monkey sewed onto the bottom of a fish. And many people were not very pleased about this. And as the story goes, a little light moment. What they saw then was a sign that said, "This way to the egress," EGRESS, and they went through a self-locking door, not fully aware or aware at all that the word egress means exit.
Out.
And
Yeah.
they were out of the building without their quarter. This was not that. Anyway, it was a great opportunity to see old friends, make some new ones, have a couple of great meals with people I care about, meet these other two gentlemen who were the stars of the show, the witnesses, and speak to some media folks. And once again, a very interesting sign of the times that you would have not have seen 5 or 6 years ago, where you had Fox and CNN respectful, doing their work properly, and not to have a quick news story that night, but both major networks working on what sounds like major documentaries, possibly several part documentaries that will be part of the coverage and the media treatments coming up in 2022, marking the 75th anniversary of our modern age of UFOs.
Talk about water cooler programming, right?
Say again?
Talk about water cooler programming.
Yeah. Count on the fact that we're going to be seeing probably some of the best UFO documentaries, television shows, and hopefully some new breaks in the story next year. Right now, we are in kind of a second golden age of television. Anybody who's been housebound for part of the last year and a half plus, as most of us have, knows that, even if you just have Netflix and Amazon and YouTube, there is a wealth of wonderful programming, some great dramas coming at us from Hollywood, from Great Britain, from Japan, from Spain, from France, from Italy. Terrific television and terrific new
lots of good
documentaries as
UFO
well.
documentaries. Yeah.
That's it.
The Phenomenon,
There
which
you
was
go.
originally slated to be in wide release in theaters
Yeah.
until the pandemic.
Yep.
We last week had Tracy Torme on, and he told us a little bit about some of the stuff that he's working on.
That's right.
Top-notch writer, as
Yep.
you know.
He was a guest on my show, I think the week before, 2 weeks before, and we discussed a myriad of past projects as well as upcoming ones as well.
If by any chance I forgot, Tracy wanted me to make sure to say hi to you and to pass on his information, which I assume by now you have.
Absolutely. We spoke actually most recently last week because Tracy will be joining a number of us for a one-day, all-day conference that's going to run, I think, almost 12 hours. And it comes on Saturday, November 6th, to mark the 45th anniversary, or 46th anniversary of the Travis Walton abduction and
Wow.
everything that spun out around that. And in fact, I think I have that information right at hand here. Yes, it's going to be held on this newer platform, which is hosting more and more virtual events called the Observation Deck.
If Peter, if you can type it into the private chat, I can put it into the comments.
Okay, I can
It's up
do
on
that.
the right-hand side. It says
Yeah.
private chat.
Hold it a second. And
It's the second one from the bottom. There you go.
There you go. And
Thank you.
this is one I would say join us if you possibly can,
Where
because
is the event?
it's let me give you a little more information on it right here.
Yeah.
It is again going to be on Saturday, November 6th, and it's going to be a tremendously good number of people who are involved or have been involved in the Travis Walton story, so to say. You can also find it by going to Travis Walton International Skyfire Summit. And some of the people who'll be taking part, besides Tracy Torme and myself, are Travis Walton, of course, Steve Pierce, who is with him as a witness, James Fox, who, of course, the great filmmaker who made the film The Phenomenon, Lee Spiegel, legendary paranormal journalist who worked for years for the Huffington Post and a dear friend, Jennifer Stein, who made the documentary, the best documentary on the Travis Walton story so far as you know, called Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton, John Goulet, another one of the witnesses, the loggers who was right there with Travis, Don Walton, Travis's brother, Bruce Cornett, a brilliant PhD analyst of this story, Ron James, another filmmaker caught up in the story very early on, Bob Terrio, who was the cameraman and on the entire Travis Walton documentary, and also the cameraman and tech guy and another one of the executive producers besides Jennifer Stein on my documentary on James Forrestal. And that's on only a partial list. Again,
really quick, can you help me with the rest of the URL? Travis Walton, what?
The URL that you have, which is the observation deck one, if you click on it, takes you right to all the information on the Travis Walton conference. It looks like a modest little URL, but it will take you right to the page, and it is only $10. Not that the only people making money on this are the tech people that are putting it together. None of the speakers are being paid for this. We just feel it's damned important to come together and mark this and assist in the way we were involved in, the story after the fact, or of course for the direct witnesses, and be a part of honoring this extraordinarily important and very well documented abduction event. So again, if you click on that link, it will take you right to the page where it will give you information on the event and also allow you to register for it. And if you register before November 1st, it's $10. So how
That's
can you
great.
possibly beat that? And
I am having some trouble with the URL. I can't.
Really, I have
I
just
just
clicked
can't
on it.
memorize it.
Take it. It's again, the observation dk.com. And
Yeah,
it
I think there's
starts,
a HTTPS.
yeah, of course, https // and then the observation dk.com.
Yeah,
You're not getting it?
it's giving me trouble just because my personal issues, but I will endeavor to type it right now.
Well, again, to everybody that's watching, if you want to go to it, https // the observation dk.com. And if you do try to get on, let us know right here in the comments area if you're able to
Ah, there we
connect.
go.
It starts at 8 in the morning and runs till 4 in the afternoon Pacific time, and will be a series of panels as well as talks, a screening of the Travis Walton documentary, and a bunch of other stuff too.
So this is just going to be a remote event. There won't be an audience there.
No, it's all virtual. But
Okay.
that's the thing about the observation deck. We will all be interacting it as avatars, so to say. And when it ends, it will end with a party that will run till midnight Pacific Standard Time, where you can mix with other people in the audience and whatever of the participants and speakers and panel members stay on. It's
That's very cool.
It is. It's another level of this technology that I am just being introduced to, but it's definitely a light year above, a nice Zoom talk where I can look at you as the audience and you can look at me as the speaker. But we're in a whole three-dimensional virtual world here, as well as, hearing standard panel discussions. Well, they won't be standard because the information is pretty spectacular. It will also address the recent controversy of this spate of attacks on Travis's credibility. And I think for anybody that's been following that story, they will really be taken aback to the degree with which it is all refuted with actual verifiable information and not just, a continued shouting match back and forth.
Right. It will be nice once we get there. I don't know if there's a light at the end of the tunnel or not, Peter.
Yeah.
But it will be nice when that day comes to be able to attend these conferences in person again.
I'm an optimist by nature, and at the same time, whatever our positions on vaccinations and, other means to stem the tide here, I am more and more confident, and this with a number of medical professionals in the family who are on the case here professionally on at least a weekly basis, as well as trying to do my best to keep up as objectively as I can, coming at it with my points of view and entrenched views, that sometime next year, hopefully by the spring, we will be starting to see the return of actual conferences where, well, like this thing at the National Press Club, we were all masked, when we came into the building. The speakers were masked when they weren't speaking, unless
Right
I
up
was
to the
taking
podium.
a sip of my coffee. I had my mask on. It was just socially considerate as far as I was concerned.
Sure.
But at the luncheon, we sat together and we talked to each other. And we, in the public spaces in the National Press Club or in the hotel where I stayed at, which conveniently was right next door, when you walked into the restaurant for dinner, you wore masks. You wore masks until you were seated at your table or in your booth. And I would expect that we will be seeing the return of conferences, certainly not just on UFOs, but, they will be coming back next year. And I am also confident I'm confident in my hope that they will be back in gear by next summer, because we have a series of important UFO conferences coming at us. Again, not just the big ones and the smaller ones, but the big and the smaller ones marking the 75th anniversary of our modern age of UFOs. I will say here publicly for the first time that I am honored to have been invited to be a speaker at next year's International MUFON Symposium. Next year will be in Denver. I'm also honored to have been invited to give the keynote after dinner speech and to moderate the panel discussions there. I am hopeful, don't know yet, but I am very hopeful. I'll be returning to Roswell and their big conference and festival the week before that. And certainly the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO conference and festival that comes up on Labor Day weekend. Also, unless there's some real change in the international scene in a bad way, by May of next year, for the first time in, I guess, 4 years, no, 5 years by then, I will be back in the United Kingdom speaking at a conference that unfortunately has been pushed back for 2 years now, the Outer Limits magazine sponsored UFO conference in Hull in May. And that's what I've been looking forward to for 2 years now. And hopefully won't have to look forward to it for an additional third year, and just will be there in May. So again, as you know, this thing ain't going away per se, but it is becoming, certainly in the first world, more and more manageable. I think, to digress for one moment, we now have to start to keep our focus on the third world countries, in many cases, which have not even begun their vaccination programs. And as long as there are cases out there, there is a potential of new variations and it coming back to our shores in a new form. So all we can do is the best we can do. And that's a challenge in a free country with a lot of points of view on the best way to handle things. But
yeah, well put. I am pulling up the On Wings site here so that people can get a look at said documentary. And I believe, unless I'm very much mistaken, and please let me know, that we will be giving away one of your DVD copies of James Forrestal, His Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death.
Yeah, but while you're on the page here, let's go to the Travis Walton trailer, which probably a number of you, and it's right there. If you can go full screen on that, this is the best documentary on the subject made, as far as I'm concerned. And to say it's a multiple award-winning documentary is an understatement. It's won several dozen. Sound? Take it from the top with audio, full screen.
Yeah. I need to break my screen share and do it again and hit the sound button. And hope this is not going to get me a copyright strike.
Oh, no. I can tell you right now, as an associate producer, we want this shown.
All right. We'll full screen it.
Yep.
And give it a play.
Great.
It was a terrifying experience.
I thought we was going to go to jail for murder.
That day, we were a little behind, so we worked until it was starting to get dark.
We loaded up the equipment and hadn't driven very far when we caught glimmers of this glow coming through the trees. I urged Mike to hurry up and get up there.
Travis had the door open before we even stopped. As he got closer, I heard the sound.
One of the guys said, "You feel that?"
I really panicked then.
I told him, "Get the hell out of here."
It didn't come directly to me. It came to
the deputy sheriff.
Three of us volunteered right away to tell him what had happened.
Sheriff Gillespie definitely didn't believe it.
He says that we better be certain because we get in a lot of trouble.
When we went to search the next day, they split us up. And the whole time, the deputies asked me, if you just tell us where the body is, we can all go home and get this over with.
We're talking about 100 people combing through the wooded area. Nothing turns up.
All week long, I've been hearing they're going to set it up to make you guys look guilty.
We're a rough-looking bunch then. Some of us have been in trouble with the law before.
And y'all ain't never going to come out of that jailhouse.
We couldn't get out.
I tried to sneak out the back door the day of the polygraph test. I was scared to death.
And on top of that, you have media.
I literally would be on 2 telephones at the same time.
We've even got some coots in here now that's coming in and out to see the freak show, as they call it.
Everyone descends.
I just wasn't going to stand there and listen to it anymore.
Grant, he says, this is Travis. I'm back. I need help.
When I did hear that he had been returned, it was almost as unbelievable as the original thing.
I just looked at my mom and says, I told you we didn't kill him.
Travis Walton reappeared after several days with a bizarre story about a ride in an unidentified flying object.
People were desperate to explain it away.
Why are you sticking up with Travis for all this time? You know this really didn't happen.
What happened to Travis after we took off in that truck, I can't tell you.
I hated Travis for a long time after this. My whole world just tore up.
But I believe every word Travis said about it. He's never lied to me about nothing.
It's a net negative. We lost our jobs in the immediate aftermath.
And now you're not able to talk about it with anyone because you know that they're going to laugh at you, they're going to look at you like you're crazy.
But if you don't come out and tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it for you.
There's a degree of responsibility. Certainly I have to accept the bad. If I can direct what's happened in a way that I can make something good happen in the world, I'm looking for it.
And I'm very much looking forward to getting a copy of that, although I have seen it. It's an excellent documentary.
Yeah, I'm biased more than most people, in part, not just because I was an associate producer on the film, but I'm the person that introduced Travis to Jennifer Stein, who is the filmmaker and the executive producer who made the film. And Jennifer and her cameraman, my dear friend Bob Terrio, kept going back to Arizona from their homes in Pennsylvania to meet with the crew members, to meet with Sheriff Gillespie, long retired at that point, family members, community residents, people who were involved in that story one way or the other from the get-go. It took 5 years to make that documentary. And I'm as sure as I can be that Jennifer, who dedicated that part of her life to it, will never make back the money she invested in it. But the wonderful thing is that we have it. It's out there. It's won several dozen film festival awards. It's been screened in some of the most unlikely venues imaginable. But it's more than a great UFO documentary. It's a great documentary. And I'm very pleased that Jen has agreed to allow it to be shown as part of our virtual conference coming up on November 6th, which I hope you will all be attending with me. And
wouldn't miss it.
Say again?
I said I wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, me neither. Well, I'm obligated now, which is fine with me. But also, it can be streamed on Amazon and Netflix, definitely, and at least one other main, film location. You
I
can
believe also on YouTube.
I don't think so. It's definitely a pay-per-view item.
YouTube has some content that you have to pay for, but
okay,
it might be
checking.
It might be Amazon Prime or who knows.
Yeah, I think it is Amazon Prime. Well, I know it's either that or Netflix, but also the DVD itself has a number of extra features. And Jen and Bob have been hard at work on essentially a follow-up. We were able to shoot so much quality film that, like any good filmmaker, you want to go into that editing process with, not to try to pump it up and, add some packing to it so it fills out, the time, or, like in a book, make the type bigger so it has more pages. You want to go in with hours and hours worth of more quality material than you can possibly use, so that your final edit is based on all quality material straight through. And
which you speak about with some authority on the subject, because your documentary is here, and I presume we can also play the trailer for that. Yes?
Yes.
All right. And we'll go to YouTube and make it big and have a listen.
In my 40 plus years in UFO studies, one individual personal story has stuck in my mind since I was first introduced to it in 1987. It's the story of the life, the rise, the extraordinary accomplishments, and the death and circumstances surrounding the same of our first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. And growing up in the time I did, I became a passionate amateur historian of post-war America. James Forrestal was a true patriot. He served his country with great devotion, and most folks don't know who he was. Most people in America, if they've ever heard his name, it has to do with the fact that an aircraft carrier was named after him, a campus on Princeton. If you work in the intelligence community, there is a medal, the Forrestal Award. There's a bust of James Forrestal in the rotunda of the Pentagon, but he's been lost to history. And as time passed, that bothered me more and more, especially because he gave his life for his country as much as any soldier that had fallen in battle. And so I began years ago to simply collect information on him, going through out-of-print memoirs by individuals that knew him, newspaper articles, documents, reports, FBI files, and then would set it aside and work on something else. Several years ago, it kind of came to a head for me, and I thought this is a story that needed to be told, and needed to be told in a way that was extremely pragmatic and well documented. There's a tremendous amount of myth, legend, lore surrounding Forrestal's life and death, some of which may well be true. I put that all aside and worked with a model of material I could present in a court of law. I ended up writing an hour-long script, and working with my associate producers Jennifer Stein and Bob Terrio, we created, I won't even call it a documentary. It's very modest in its undertaking, but it tells the story in a way that I hope Americans will never forget. I think the most important part for me is that we not only remember this man, but we look to him as a role model of true service. I hope you'll enjoy this documentary, but I also hope you'll learn something from it. And if you come away feeling as I do, that you'll share that with other people. Americans need to know who their fallen hero was and the circumstances surrounding his extraordinary life and very suspicious death.
Great stuff, Peter.
Thank you.
And as someone who has seen that documentary, I can say it's very powerful and very important, especially if someone, is unaware. Everybody, please make sure that you have gone to the URL on your screen and entered the giveaway for Peter's documentary about James Forrestal. And while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and hawk my own wares. We have, for the first time ever, merchandise that can be ordered. We have shirts of different varieties, so you can support your favorite paranormal show on YouTube. And we have coffee cups, all kinds of great stuff. And they've been priced so that there's literally no profit. It's strictly to get the word out about the show. So rather than charging what might be a prohibitive amount, as some other YouTubers might do, these are just kind of a thank you to be a walking billboard. So if somebody sees you in the shirt and says, "What's Into the Fringe?" then you can just turn around and say, it's my favorite paranormal show on YouTube. And YouTube/Cardinal Sin is pretty easy to remember. And these mugs are really cool. All this merchandise is on its way. I'll be doing unboxing of all of that. So stay tuned for that as well. I'm very appreciative, especially to Fet for Hire and other artists for helping me out. And Peter, were there any other photos that you wanted to get up from the selection that we were drawing from? I apologize. You're muted. Can you start over? You were. I apologize. Can you repeat?
Just that I think that there are a few that we have not yet shown that were part of the PowerPoint projection, most of them involving quotations or bullet points from the witnesses or, well-known personalities in the work. Let's see what we have left there. Yeah, this was part of, I believe it was David's.
I mistook Miss-Aliers for misspellers the first time I read it.
Yeah, this is part of David Schindley's statement. And again, it speaks for itself. These men obviously were very carefully vetted. It wasn't just, you're in the Air Force here, you're in charge of nuclear weapons. It's, I think, understood that they had to be subjected to all kinds of, not just background checks, but you don't want somebody who's going to come undone in a stressful situation. the way they used to say it was with their finger on the nuclear button, but it didn't work that way. In fact, it's more chilling in a way. If you got the go code, there was a console that you sat at, and one individual could not launch nuclear weapons on their own. You needed two. You had the senior nuclear weapons officer, so to say, and the associate officer. And they were seated at a console, but they could not, no matter how far they stretched, one could not physically touch the other. And each man had a key, like a key, a car key, a house key. And at the orders of the senior officer, those keys were inserted. And at the exact same moment, they were turned. And that was how the nuclear missiles were launched back then. And as chilling, certainly on a personal level, was if for any reason that associate officer refused to follow orders. I think anybody might have a cause for hesitation. Was that go code absolutely authentic? Was there any possible way that our enemies could have doctored that message? You're about to either start or contribute to the third and likely last World War. But if that officer hesitated, once that order had been cleared, the other officer was obligated to take out their sidearm, which would have been a Colt 1911 model 45 automatic, dispense with that officer, and bring in a second officer to follow that order. So
heavy stuff.
Heavy stuff. Next image. And as I recall, this was either from David's account or from Robert Jacobs' account, the photographer, one or the other. I think David's.
We were to forever keep our lips zipped. We were never questioned, interrogated, or debriefed on our incident. We were never told what the security classification of the incident was. We were never instructed or trained on what to do if another incident should ever happen again. Other missile crews were never informed of our incident.
Yeah, how about that?
And this is very important, from Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the CIA.
And this statement goes back to 1960.
Yeah. Quote, "It is time for the truth to be brought out in the open. Congressional hearings, behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe that the unknown flying objects are nonsense. To hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel."
More than 60 years ago, and we're still at the same damn point, asking for congressional hearings. This really has to stop.
Yeah. I can't imagine being the guy with the key, down in that hardened bunker. You've seen in the movies where they say 3, 2, 1, and both of them turn the key. I'm not sure how factual that is, but the very idea just, depresses me. I recall, you might have heard of this, Peter, that there was a Russian counterpart to these type of people that was ordered, I think, from a submarine to send a missile to its target here in the United States, and he didn't. And it's a good thing because it ended up being, a a flock of birds or whatever. It was, not a drill, but it was misinterpreted as a real event.
That's right.
And it's very difficult to believe.
Well, that is a truly
anti-derivative
heroic
Jill.
action to disobey an order like that, especially in the Soviet Navy at that time in history. But it happened. It's real. I am aware of it. I don't remember the individual's name, but it has been verified.
And anti-derivative Jill says we still only have 2 people signed up for the giveaway. There are 9 people in the audience. So please go to that URL and sign up for the giveaway. The James Forrestal documentary DVD is powerful stuff. Powerful stuff. And I am just taking a look here. That'll be a little bit easier so that we can still talk. What's next for Peter Robbins?
Several possible projects in development, all of them on non-disclosure agreements. It's much more common that such projects, be they for a television series or projected film, don't happen. It's the nature of the beast. I don't have any idea what the stats are, but if it's 1 in 100, I wouldn't be surprised. However, a few that are percolating along, and hopefully one that will catch. An extended piece of writing that will see the light of day sometime next year. Putting together a different number of abstracts for proposals to speak at different conferences here and abroad next year. And otherwise, getting ready for autumn, which is right at the cusp right now here in central New York State. Still fairly mild, but that will shift any day. So
here in
weatherizing
northeastern Kansas, we've had a couple of heat waves where it got into the 70s, but at night it's getting into the 40s.
Yep. Only
there's a saying in Kansas: if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. All right, so I'm going to bring on my mod, Anti-Derivative Jill.
Diaper, please.
Hello, Jill.
Hello. Hello.
How are you?
Cardinal Sin and Peter. I'm doing well. Tonight we only have 3 guests on our wheel.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and bring up that wheel. Did you put yourself on?
Oh, I hadn't yet. Let me do that.
And Canadian Spider-Man, if he's still in the chat.
Would you like me to add him too?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll add him too.
And throw Andy Masterson on there if he hasn't entered.
Okay.
There we go. That's a more respectful looking spinner.
Indeed. Let me know when you're ready. Ready to go?
Let me just make sure that nobody else wants to enter. Everybody in the chat, this is the last call to be put on the wheel. Just if you don't have the URL, just say something in the chat and we'll put you on the wheel. And I'm not seeing any other entrants. So,
I do not see any as well.
Jill, let's go ahead and spin that wheel. Congratulations, JPRPH1,
Yep. Awesome. Congratulations.
who says he's been on Echo Base Network and here all night. So, JPRPH1, send me a direct message on Twitter or send me an email. With your mailing address, and we will make sure to get it to Peter. Congratulations. Jill, any news to tell us, or anything new and interesting in your life?
No, I'm still very green to all of this stuff. I've only really started listening thanks to your show, so I'm just listening for now, keeping my eyes and ears open, and I'll let you know when I have expanded further on that.
Very good. Just like Peter said, keep your eyes open. So, and JRPH1 says he will. So I'll get that information to you, Peter. Thanks again for providing our giveaway this week. Of course, for appearing on Into the Fringe. It's always wonderful to have you on. And we do, of course, look forward to the next time that you can join us.
We will be in communication, of course. And do send
Very
me that
good.
link to the press conference that's been posted.
Absolutely, I will. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I can put it into the private chat, and then you'll have it right now. The one-man show, folks. No producer. So in the private chat, I will paste it. And there you go.
Very good. Much appreciated.
And thank you very much. And for Jill and Peter, it's Cardinal Sin.